Hello and welcome to the CVL podcast, coming to you from the UT Dallas Center for Vital Longevity, which is dedicated to pursuing research that leads to cognitive health for life. Our goal is to educate you on the latest matters relating to cognition and the brain, and with each episode we'll be interviewing leading scientists and sharing their insights and suggestions to promote cognitive health throughout the lifespan. My name is Amber Kidwai.
And my name is Sarah Munir.
And this is the CVL podcast. Dr. Shayna Rosenbaum is a professor and York Research Chair in the Department of Psychology and Vision at York University and an associate scientist at the Rotman Research Institute at Baycrest. She is a registered clinical neuropsychologist who received her PhD in psychology from the University of Toronto in 2004 and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Rotman. She has published extensively on the topics of memory and decision-making and has received awards for her neuroimaging and patient research, and her work has gained diverse media attention in Canada and in the US. Her research examines how memory is represented in the brain, how cognitive functions are affected by brain damage, and how such deficits can be managed in patients. Her neuroimaging and patient studies have shown that the hippocampus is involved in future decision-making and theory of mind. In our conversation today, we discuss different types of memory, such as episodic, semantic, and spatial memory, and the role that memory plays in decision-making. We learn how thinking about the past is related to thinking about the future, and we discuss how thinking about future rewards influences decision-making. Specifically, we discuss something called discounting, which is when we value future rewards less or we discount them the further away in the future that they are. So, for example, when offered $50 today versus $100 6 months from now, many people would discount the value of the $100 because it is further away in the future and it feels less concrete, even though it is in fact double the value of the amount we're being offered today. Another term we discuss is probabilistic discounting, where a less certain reward, let's say a higher amount that we have only a 50% chance of receiving, feels less valuable to us than a lower amount that we have a 100% chance of receiving. So, for example, a guaranteed $50 would feel more valuable than $100 that you only have a 50-50 chance of receiving. We also talk about aging and how this can affect memory and decision-making, and we discuss how future thinking can affect financial decision-making and also health decisions, like choosing whether or not to get vaccinated, where you may be weighing the short-term discomfort versus the future immunity, or choosing to exercise today for the reward of a healthier body in the future. And during COVID, Dr. Rosenbaum explored how future thinking influenced decisions to engage in various protective behaviors, and we discussed some of this in this interview. Dr. Rosenbaum shares some strategies for overcoming these biases and how research is being done to assist healthy decision making. So join us as we sit with Dr. Rosenbaum to explore the fascinating relationship between thinking about the past and thinking about the future.
Dr. Rosenbaum, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we delve into your work, could you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into neuropsychology?
I'd be very happy to. Thank you very much for inviting me. So I am trained as a cognitive neuroscientist and as a clinical neuropsychologist. And to give you some background, I completed my PhD at University of Toronto in both cognitive neuroscience and clinical neuropsychology. And I went on to complete a postdoctoral fellowship at the Rotman Research Institute at Baycrest, also in Toronto. And I have been a faculty member since 2005 in the Department of Psychology at York University, which is in Toronto as well. And I'm actually still affiliated with the Rotman Research Institute as an associate scientist. And in terms of how I ended up in this field of clinical neuropsychology, like many people, I'm very fascinated by memory, how we're able to remember our past, why we forget certain things. I was touched by different family members who experienced issues with their memory. In fact, I had thought that my career path would take me into law, and ended up deciding to change paths when I had some very inspirational professors. I actually did not mention that I was an undergraduate student at the University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario, and I was very fortunate to have some neuropsychologists who were on faculty who really inspired me. And so that really led to a path of, I changed course, and I ended up having opportunities to work with very unique cases who experienced memory loss as a result of rare circumstances, which I'm happy to elaborate on later, and began to do some neuroimaging research. And really, it seems as though part of it was good fortune, and part of it was just having some wonderful mentors and investigating some issues that I felt important at the time. And
yeah, that's super cool. So from law to memory research.
Yes.
So you study memory, but you also study decision making. So what kind of got you into going in that direction?
So part of the reason that I became interested in decision making was grounded in some clinical work that I was doing with some individuals who had lesions to a part of the brain known as ventromedial prefrontal cortex, so a part of our frontal lobes that, when disrupted, seemed to affect people's abilities to make certain types of decisions, what some might call hot decisions, emotional decisions. And the reason that I was exposed to these populations, certainly in the course of clinical work, I might see the odd case, but at the time that I completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Rotman Research Institute, my supervisor, who sadly passed away, his name was Donald Stuss, was very well known in the frontal lobe field, and was really inspirational in helping me to realize that decision making is not one thing, and that it intersects with a variety of other cognitive capacities, including the kinds of memory that I was interested in as a graduate student, and I continue to be interested in. So that was sort of, I guess, my entry point professionally into decision making.
So your research focuses on memory and how different types of memory are represented in the brain. So could you explain the difference between episodic memory, which is memory for unique events, semantic memory or general knowledge, and then spatial memory, which underlies how we navigate in space?
Yeah, of course. So I think it's important to emphasize that memory is not just one thing. And we've learned from a variety of different types of individuals with brain lesions and from neuroimaging and other methods that there are different forms of memory, including episodic memory, which refers to our memory of past personal events, so what we've experienced at a particular time and place. And semantic memory, which relates to facts about our world, facts about ourselves, so knowing who our parents are, knowing that Paris is the capital of France. But in order to remember semantic memories or have semantic facts, you don't have to necessarily travel to a particular time and place to retrieve that fact. So we would say that semantic memories, unlike episodic memories, are not context dependent. Spatial memory, so we can think of spatial memory as actually intersecting episodic and semantic memory. And some of the research that I've conducted shows that perhaps spatial memory, which here I'll define as our ability to represent large-scale spaces, certainly spatial memory relates to a variety of different aspects of representing the world around us, enabling us to navigate in that world. But it seemed in some of the work that I had conducted that even spatial memory might have episodic-like and semantic-like components, that you might know about certain places that you visited, know facts about those places, maybe even retain the gist of a particular environment. But you don't have to remember all of the specific details relating to that environment in order to navigate. And we could think of that as being very different than those details that allow us to richly re-experience an environment, but that aren't necessarily necessary for navigation.
So what parts of the brain are involved in these different types of memory?
Well, so I've been very interested in a part of the brain known as the hippocampus, in part because it's a region of the brain that is highly vulnerable to a wide range of neurological conditions, including Alzheimer's disease, certain forms of epilepsy, viral encephalitis, and even changes as a result of neurotypical aging. And the hippocampus seems to be a region that is believed to be necessary for episodic memory, so remembering these past personal details that we've experienced. And there are theories that suggest that the hippocampus is necessary for what is known as allocentric spatial memory. So when I defined spatial memory, I was describing it in terms of what I've been focusing on, but to provide a more detailed definition, allocentric spatial memory refers to our ability to represent different places in our external world in relation to one another. It's different from what is known as egocentric spatial memory, which refers to our ability to represent places in relation to the self. Egocentric spatial memory is a less flexible form of memory. Allocentric spatial memory, however, allows us to almost represent an environment from a bird's eye view, and it's believed to be much more flexible in nature. And the hippocampus was believed to be strongly associated with allocentric spatial memory. But we've actually shown that some aspects of even allocentric spatial memory might not depend always on the hippocampus. And then finally, I defined semantic memory, and although it was believed that semantic memory does not depend on the hippocampus, there are some nuances there as well. So some recent work showing that the hippocampus might indeed actually be needed for some aspects of semantic memory, even if it's not needed for all aspects of that form of memory.
So I kind of wanted to delve a little bit more into how you study which of brain areas are involved in these different types of memories. So you've used case studies as well as neuroimaging in your work. Could you tell us how these have given us a better understanding of memory and better understanding where in the brain these memories are located?
Absolutely. So we started out with a range of studies that have involved individual cases and actually groups of patients who have unique lesions to the hippocampus and actually other parts of the brain that are believed to be involved in supporting these forms of memory. I should have mentioned earlier that the hippocampus is not the only region involved in the forms of memory that I had defined, but the way that we apply the methods that you just asked about, so with regard to the patient work that we do, when we're fortunate to work with individuals who have lesions to specific parts of their brain, and I'll focus here on the hippocampus just as an example, we're able to better understand what that part of the brain does. So the assumption is that if a part of the brain, like the hippocampus, is lesioned and other parts of the brain seem relatively intact, at least structurally, then the assumption is that if that person with the hippocampal lesion performs poorly on a particular task, so say they are unable to remember certain facts about the world, the inference is that the hippocampus is necessary for performing that particular task. And so in our work, we've shown that the hippocampus is necessary for remembering specific details of past events because people with lesions to the hippocampus have tremendous difficulty conjuring up those sorts of details. Different forms of neuroimaging can be seen as complementary measures or methods. We can make different kinds of inferences with regard to the function or the processes in which a particular brain region or network of brain regions are involved. And it allows us to measure activity within those brain regions as a participant is performing a task. Unlike patient work, as I've described it, functional neuroimaging, although it does allow us to know if a region of the brain is involved, it might not provide us with conclusive evidence with respect to if a region is absolutely necessary for a function. And we've actually shown that even though, for instance, and again, I'm just going to keep using the example of the hippocampus, even though the hippocampus seems to be activated when participants are performing a spatial memory task, we find that patients who have damage to that same brain region are in fact able to navigate places that they had learned long ago. So it's important to be able to reconcile some of the discrepancies in findings across these methods. It's of course very reassuring when you see convergence in data that come from these complementary methods, and often that's the case. And so having these different layers, different methods to provide support for some of the theories that we're testing is very useful in understanding how the brain works.
So your research has also explored how memory impairments affect future thinking. How is thinking about the past related to thinking about the future?
So there seems to be a very intimate relationship between thinking about the past and thinking about the future. And it turns out that individuals who have difficulty remembering past events, so they have impaired episodic memory, also have difficulties imagining specific future events, so they have impaired episodic future imagining. But those same individuals who have deficits in the two, they show spared performance on tests of semantic memory, so we're remembering facts about the past, including about themselves, for example. And they show similar preservation when it comes to imagining facts that might relate to the future. So we see this relationship not just in episodic memory and future thinking, but also in terms of semantic memory and semantic future thinking. We've done some research to show that future imagining, although it does seem to be impaired in individuals with episodic memory impairment, it is not one thing, and that future imagining or future thinking actually has components that might even be spared in individuals with episodic amnesia. It may be because we have to really be careful in separating out the episodic from the semantic components of future imagining. But it may also be the case that certain aspects even of episodic future imagining or future thinking might show some sparing. So I think there's still quite a bit of research that needs to be done to better understand the deficits that seem to emerge in individuals who have episodic memory problems. And hopefully we'll be able to better understand these nuances or dissociations with a variety of methods.
I can see like an episodic event, they're imagining themselves in there, right? It's a personal event. How do you imagine a semantic event?
So with regard to imagining something semantic, so a future semantic, and I would say not event, but maybe a fact. So when we have people imagining facts about the future, it might relate to a public event, for example. So it might be event related, but it may or may not involve the self. And people who have episodic memory deficits, they can still think about the self and make appropriate judgments and actually remember facts about themselves from the past. It's just that when you ask them to retrieve contextual details relating to their past, they have a lot of difficulty. And the same would hold true of the future. But when I speak about future semantic information that people might imagine, that could relate to maybe something relating to climate change, something that is more generic, that isn't tied to a specific time and place, that could occur in the future. So that would be an example.
So you also examine the role of memory in decision making, and your research looks at how imagining future events affects how we value rewards, especially when we have to wait for them. So one concept that you explore is called discounting, where a reward feels less valuable the longer we have to wait for it. There's also another concept called probability discounting, where the less certain a reward is, the less valuable it feels to us. Could you explain what these are in more detail and what your research has shown?
I think you've done an excellent job describing them. So just to say that, and really kind of repeating what you've said, temporal discounting or delay discounting involves deciding between choosing a small immediate reward. So if we put this in monetary terms, deciding whether to take $10 today versus accepting a larger but delayed reward, such as $100 a month from now. And we set up these experiments to vary the delay in which somebody is going to receive or imagine receiving the larger later reward, and also the amount of the immediate reward. So it may be $10, we might raise it to $50 today versus $100 a month from now, or it could be $50 today versus $100 3 months from now, and people will vary their decisions based on the delay or the time that they have to wait to receive that larger later reward. The longer the delay, the less likely they're going to choose the later reward. And also we vary the amount of the immediate reward as I've described in my example. Probabilistic discounting is a little bit different. So it's similar in the sense that people need to choose between two reward amounts, one smaller reward versus a larger reward. But instead of varying the time between receiving the rewards, we vary the certainty in receiving the rewards. And so the decision, as you've already mentioned, is between receiving a smaller reward that's certain. So you can receive $10 and there's a 100% chance of receiving the $10, or you can take a risk and accept $50, but there's a 40% chance of you receiving that $50. Mm-hmm. Are you willing to take that risk? What would you choose? It turns out that there's some similar processes underlying these two forms of decision making, but there's also some dissociations. And one dissociation, and this has been seen in neurotypical individuals, so just healthy young adults, older adults, is that if you provide people with specific cues to imagine an event when they're making those decisions, if it relates to delay discounting, and you say, okay, will you choose $10 today or $100 a month from now? And imagine that in a month from now, you're going to be going on a trip. That actually induces people to accept the future reward. It makes them more likely to discount that future reward less. But when it comes to probability discounting or probabilistic discounting, if you give people a specific cue to imagine an event, it doesn't seem to change whether they're going to make the decision to take the certain reward versus the uncertain reward. So behavioral economic models that viewed those two forms of discounting as similar need to be reconciled with the finding that I just described, where adding in that imagining component actually does something very different to delay discounting compared to probabilistic discounting.
So what you're saying is it seems like vividly imagining future events helps to reduce our tendency to value those later rewards
That's
less.
Right.
So we maintain that value because we can kind of maybe vividly imagine getting the reward later on.
That's right.
And then you were saying that older adults seem to discount less than younger adults, even with cues. So
Yes,
do they discount less overall as well?
There are mixed findings.
Okay.
So in our research, we have shown a greater tendency for older adults to discount future rewards less, even without cues. So that would, I think, be considered overall.
So that means that they're more likely to wait for the bigger reward.
That's right. But there are other people who've shown no difference between younger and older adults, and yet other labs that have shown that older adults are actually steeper in discounting. And I think what this suggests is that we need to look at other variables. It's really important to consider, for example, level of income and general socioeconomic status. And we know from some research that we've conducted, actually more global level research, when we investigate discounting in countries that show great economic disparities or hyperinflation, there's a greater tendency in the whole population to show steeper discounting. And perhaps, and we don't know yet, but it may be the case that there's an even greater effect in older adults compared to younger adults. So there are interactions amongst these variables. And the types of tasks that I've described, so the temporal discounting versus probabilistic discounting, in the lab we treat them separately. But oftentimes in everyday life, you have conditions where you're asked to decide between accepting a reward today versus something, 5 years from now, and there's also different probabilities, and you have to look at the combination of these variables.
Can older adults' past life experience play a role in improving their decision-making abilities, or do the cognitive changes that occur with age limit their ability to consider past experiences when they're making these decisions?
So I think it's an excellent question, and one might imagine that as we age and we're accumulating multiple life experiences, we'd be in a better position to make certain kinds of decisions, especially if we need to call on our past. But interestingly, it turns out that, at least in some of the work that we've conducted, even if people have past experiences relating to the decision at hand, or even if they have a financial background, or have other types of knowledge that would be unique to somebody who's older compared to somebody who's younger, it doesn't seem to factor into the kinds of decisions that I've described before. So discounting behaviors, so deciding between a smaller immediate reward versus a larger later reward. That's not to say that past experience doesn't influence the other kinds of decisions that people make. We haven't really looked at other forms of decision that could depend on life experiences, but there are other labs that are studying these sorts of questions. And I think one very interesting area that perhaps is somewhat understudied is the area of wisdom. And we assume in a lot of research that based on a lot of research, that older adults will have greater difficulties or show areas of cognitive decline. But it turns out that there's some areas that are maintained even into older adulthood, if not better than how they were expressed in younger adulthood. And it's really, I think, very interesting to look at whether wisdom, and I think this is what you're really getting at, this accumulation of life experience might factor into the kinds of decisions people make.
So you've also found that imagining future events didn't affect how people valued rewards that were uncertain. So we kind of talked about the probabilistic rewards. So this could refer to things like gambling or risky investments. Why does imagining the future help with delayed rewards, but not with probabilistic ones? Are there different brain systems involved?
So it's a very good question, and even though our work didn't show a relationship, that's not to say that there is absolutely no relationship between imagining specific events and even deciding between certain versus uncertain rewards. It might be the way that we've tested individuals. But part of the reason that I think we're not seeing an effective specific event cues or episodic future thinking on probabilistic discounting is because probabilistic discounting doesn't have the same kind of time-based structure that episodic future thinking does. And so it just might be the way that people are cued. And perhaps if people are given other sorts of facts, maybe relating to actual risk versus perceived risk, then you would see differences in the way that people make decisions. And so it's not that you can't change or I guess, benefit decision-making with different forms of cueing or different forms of information that are that is provided. I think it's just a matter of how again, the question is asked and the type of information, whether it really matches the processes. And I think, again, just getting back to the beginning of your question, whether this tells us if different processes are involved, yes, I think it certainly does. That, there might be some overlap in the brain regions that support these different forms of discounting and decision making, and then of course some differences.
So in your research, have you found that older adults with memory impairments tend to make different kinds of financial decisions compared to those with better memory retention?
So we haven't found very many differences in the kinds of future regarding decisions that individuals with amnesia would make relative to individuals without amnesia, without episodic memory impairment. Again, that's not to say that if they were pushed in a certain direction that they wouldn't make different kinds of decisions. And there are certainly individual differences based on those individuals' past experiences, areas of expertise, and so on that, we really haven't uncovered yet. I think, another area that I think is of relevance, it's not an area that I study, but some of my colleagues have looked at means-end problem solving. And it does seem as though when having to think flexibly about a problem in different ways, then you're tapping into similar systems or processes that are required for episodic remembering. And those sorts of decisions do seem to depend on similar processes to episodic memory and would likely be impaired or different, at least, in individuals with amnesia.
Mm-hmm. So research indicates that older adults may be more susceptible to financial scams. How do memory and cognitive changes contribute to this vulnerability?
Well, I think one aspect that I have not touched on, which is outside of memory, is executive function. And I think that there are certain other capacities that change with aging that might influence the kinds of decisions that older adults make, and also vulnerability to certain forms of deception. There's also differences in personality characteristics that could lead to changes in vulnerability to fraud and other forms of deception as people get older. Again, that might not depend on memory per se. And I think this is a really important area, of course, to investigate. I have some colleagues actually at York University. Gary Turner is one of them, along with Nathan Sprang, who is at the Montreal Neurological Institute, who are looking exactly at these questions.
So we've talked a lot about memory and decision making, but your research has also shown that delay discounting, which we've talked about earlier, is a correlate of health behavior. So I'd kind of like to delve into that a little bit. Specifically, you found that delay discounting was a behavioral marker of vaccine compliance, so during the COVID-19 epidemic. Could you kind of talk a little bit more about what you found there?
Yeah, no, I'm very happy to speak about that. So it's known from a broad literature that I actually haven't touched on that delay discounting is also a marker of different health-related behaviors, including substance use, including obesity, and other health changes and challenges. And we were very interested in knowing if discounting would allow us to help identify individuals who might be making decisions that are not optimal for themselves during a situation like a pandemic. And the COVID-19 pandemic provided the conditions in which to test this kind of question. And so we were interested in delay discounting in particular because if you can imagine that the kinds of decisions that we make between deciding to accept a small immediate reward or even loss versus a larger delayed reward or loss map onto a variety of situations that were presented to the population globally during the COVID-19 pandemic. So just using vaccination as an example, there was so much uncertainty, and not just uncertainty, but also there were different ideas about and facts that were provided with respect to the benefits of vaccination that had to be considered in relation to the long-term changes that somebody might experience having taken a vaccine or accepted a vaccine. The same held true for other public health measures. So the costs, for example, associated with physical distancing, so not being able to be in contact with loved ones, which results in a significant loss in isolation or social loneliness. And that had to be measured against the benefits of physical distancing and not infecting people so that it would risk others' lives. And so it really seemed intuitive to us to understand how delay discounting, as an example, might relate to other sorts of decisions that were at play during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we tested a very large group of individuals across 13 countries. We ended up with a sample of around 7,000 individuals, and we found indeed that the steeper a person's delay discounting, the more likely they were to be unwilling to accept a vaccination. And that made sense to us because if somebody is less willing to accept a larger future reward versus a more immediate, smaller reward, then they might be less willing to accept the long-term benefits of a vaccine, given that there's short-term benefits of not being vaccinated.
And the short-term side effects, for example, individual will experience short-term side effects after getting the vaccination. So you have to compare that with the long-term benefits that you get with being vaccinated.
Exactly. And so that really went into our thinking when we were initially designing the experiments, and it played out in the way that we had expected. We had looked at a number of other variables at the time. And we were interested in interactions with anxiety and, again, income level and age, country in which people lived. And still, we found that after controlling for all of those different kinds of variables, delay discounting still predicted if somebody was willing to be vaccinated or not.
So in everyday life, we face delayed discounting situations all the time, like choosing to exercise today for better health in the future, or resisting unhealthy snacks. So how can we use your findings to motivate ourselves to make better decisions, especially for long-term goals?
So I think, and I want to say that this work is not just work that has been conducted in my own lab, but there are many labs that have been looking at these questions, and in fact, looking specifically at the example that you provided. And I think, the most obvious intervention would be increasing awareness that, we have these tendencies to act now and choose something that will benefit us now, and we resist wanting to wait in order to benefit later, and usually benefit in a greater way. So making people aware that there is this form of decision-making that might actually not be optimal in the long run is important. But in indirect ways, we can induce better longer-term decision-making. And one of those ways, in fact, is providing people with cues to imagine future events when they're making decisions. We've actually been applying this question to climate change. So some of the research that's being conducted in my lab right now, in collaboration with a number of folks at York University, happens to be looking at whether people will make better decisions now for a better future with respect to the environment. And we're really interested in knowing if we can convince people, for example, to use the grid during off time, so doing laundry in the evening rather than when electrical demands are higher during the day. If we can convince people to make those changes in their lifestyle, which are not major, then perhaps they can, that's a form of thinking about a better future, that, those small changes can actually allow us to preserve energy and hopefully lead to other positive effects for our environment. So that's an application that we've been looking into.
So have any of these on the research on delayed discounting been applied in public policy when it comes to like health decisions? I mean, from anything from COVID vaccinations to other vaccinations or healthy eating and that kind of thing. Has it informed public policy at all?
Well, I'm not sure if it has yet, but this is actually a really big challenge in research that we do. That our hope, our aspiration, is to influence public policy when it's relevant, of course. And in our case, we've been in very close contact with the Public Health Agency of Canada. We're conducting our research in Canada to help them come up with campaigns to induce changes in decision making, so that if we're faced, for example, with another pandemic, we'll be able to better inform people of different forms of decision making that might play out during the pandemic, to kind of get them to put the brakes on the kinds of decisions that they would feel a natural propensity towards, and part of putting this into effect requires direct communication with policymakers. So in our case, we've been very fortunate to have wonderful contacts. And again, I can't say how it's going to look at the end of the day, but but there's a lot of reception, at least in our country, okay, for inducing change and at a population level.
So with that in mind, on an individual level, what kind of strategies or tools can individuals use to help improve their ability to plan and make decisions?
Okay, so I mentioned episodic cueing or episodic future thinking as one example. One strategy or another strategy that we've used that might relate is making things more meaningful to the self. And so we know, at least in memory research and some of the work that I've done in the past, along with some of my excellent graduate students, I'll mention one, Nicole Carson, who ran some studies looking at the self-reference effect, which is an effect that is seen in episodic memory research, where if you try to learn, for example, a list of words, but you think of those words in relation to yourself, you're more likely to remember those words compared to if you think of those words in relation to somebody else or in some other way that's not as meaningful. And so perhaps different strategies that relate to kind of self-reference could help even in decision making. We've been very interested in other strategies that people have taken, again, to improve memory that might be applied to decision making. And sometimes it relates to even repetitions of something very simple, and having people trying to kind of learn to make a certain decision over and over again, and then spacing the repetition. So we know that in memory, if you space out the repetition, which just means adding items that intervene between two repeated items, it actually helps you to remember better compared to if you had presented the repeated items in immediate succession. And so some application of that to decision making might be beneficial as well. And there's a range of different interventions that we hope at an individual level can be performed.
Yeah, those are really great tips. I'll definitely be applying that to my practice. So where can our listeners learn more about your work?
So I invite listeners to visit my webpage at York University, and it's actually under my name. We also have a program called Connected Minds, Neural Human and Machine Systems for a Healthy, Just Society. It's a program that is funded by the Canada First Research Excellence Fund, and it describes some of the research that we do, but also research that my colleagues do at York University, together with Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. It's research that integrates neuroscience with AI technology and society, and involves research on decision making, but also research on socially responsible use of technology, ranging from that all the way to socially assisted robots and navigation. And so if anybody's interested, we highlight exciting research that's coming out of that program.
Awesome. Dr. Rosenbaum, I really enjoyed talking with you today and learning more about your great contributions to the study of memory and decision making. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing about your future research.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the CVL podcast. If you like what you're hearing, please follow and share with others. This podcast wouldn't be possible without the support of our team and the incredible work that goes on behind the scenes. We'd like to give special thanks to Soumya Sambamurthy and Josh Olivier for editing this episode. To learn more about the Centre for Vital Longevity, just look up cvl.utdallas.edu, and here you'll find information about our research, as well as information on how to volunteer to participate in our studies and how to donate to support innovative research to understand, protect, and enhance the vitality of the mind across the lifespan. Join us next time as we continue to explore the latest research and strategies for keeping our brains healthy throughout our lives.